The government's controversial metadata retention laws look set to pass Parliament under a deal with Labor. The compromise requires security agencies to obtain a warrant if they want to use data to identify journalist sources. Joining me now from Canberra is Green Senator Scott Ludlam. Senator Ludlam, good morning. So the government's including a provision that a warrant will have to be obtained before accessing journalist sources. What degree of protection will that offer?
Well, it'll raise the bar. It'll mean that it's not a simple exercise of paper shuffling to allow agencies to access journalists' private communications. But nobody's really convinced that this fixes the bill, apparently, apart from Bill Shorten. If you look at what the Journalist Union said overnight, they are basically scathing. Why is the government so keen on coming after journalist sources in the first place? And what about the rest of the population that will shortly be subjected to these laws?
The government argues that even if a warrant is sought, there are other protections built into the legislation, including a Commonwealth Ombudsman to oversee it. Why don't those provisions satisfy you?
Because it's absolute window dressing. And of course, we would support an increased role for the Ombudsman. But the fact is, we believe that agencies, if they're doing intrusive snooping into people's private information, should be required to get a warrant, whether you're a journalist or not. And we have Commonwealth Shield laws, which were quite hard fought for, and which I think Senator Brandis even voted for, aimed to protect journalists from being dragged into court, having to disclose their sources. And yet agencies are circumventing those laws by just pulling people's phone records.
So we'll get to the broader concerns about the community generally in a moment, but it's just to do with journalists. What other provisions do you think need to be in there to protect journalist sources?
I think we need a prohibition on governments going after journalist sources or agencies going after journalist sources. And this has become quite epidemic under this government. For example, reporting on the horrors of our prison camps on Pacific Island with asylum seekers, rather than fixing the issues and the brutality that's occurring on our watch. This government has preferred to refer particular media stories to the federal police. So I think we need legal protections to prevent that kind of thing, which is obviously well out of scope of this indiscriminate data collection plan that's before Parliament now.
And the government's argument to that is that the community, it believes that community generally doesn't think journalists should be above the law.
No, nobody's suggesting journalists should be above the law. If journalists are breaking the law or committing criminal activity, you're subject to the same laws of the land as everybody else. These are specific referrals to the federal police to try and deter investigative journalism of issues that are strongly in the public interest. And I think that for a government that claims to be all about free speech, that's horrific.
And so you think that can be easily defined?
Look, I think it can certainly be defined. There are other jurisdictions, you know, this process underway in the UK. The United States have better protections for these kind of things. You can't just indiscriminately go in and pull the phone records of journalists, and protecting sources is actually very difficult.
So it looks like this law is going to pass. What are your broader concerns about privacy apart from journalists?
Joe, I haven't given up yet, quite honestly. In the Parliament as volatile as this, anything is possible. My broader concerns is that I've never seen a bill brought in before. The government couldn't define to within the nearest $100 million what it's going to cost or who's going to pay. So effectively it's a surveillance tax that Australians are being asked to pay to be spied on. That's unacceptable. The whole principle that the phone and internet records of millions of innocent people who aren't suspected of anything should be archived for 2 years just in case we turn out to be a security risk. It's the principle that is offensive and offends the principle of targeted, proportionate, discriminate and warranted law enforcement.
So do you think the debate that there's been around this so far is reflective of the community concern about this, or is there a level of disconnect with this issue and what could be at stake?
Look, I think you're quite right. That's quite perceptive, as there is a disconnect on so many other issues where the major parties, and Bill Shorten teaming up with Tony Abbott, to pass a deeply unpopular measure that completely sidesteps concerns that have been raised by groups as diverse as the Law Council, the Australian Press Council, and particularly industry. Yesterday we saw a letter to George Brandis signed by the CEOs of every major telecommunications company in Australia, demanding to know who on earth is going to pay the costs, because this may well send smaller internet service providers to the wall. So much for this deregulation agenda, and that these issues have been completely sidestepped by this deal that Bill Shorten appears to have done with Tony Abbott.
So what are you going to be doing over the next few weeks to try and turn this around?
Well, we don't have very long. Part of the problem is that these things are just being done on a handshake and by exchange of correspondence. Nobody has actually seen the wording of the amendments yet. So we're going to have to work very hard over the next couple of days once the amendments are published, assuming that they are before debate starts, to see whether the government's given effect to the kind of commitments that it's made. And we will be turning up the heat and turning up the pressure on the Labor Party. Do not throw this beleaguered, failed Prime Minister a surveillance lifeline. I think the Parliament is better than that, and this country needs an opposition at the moment.
Senator Scott Ludlam, thanks for talking to us this morning.
Thank you.